Hi everyone, welcome back to this SQL tutorial series. In today's episode, we are going to learn about functions. So for topic-wise, we'll be learning about what exactly is functions, why do we need to learn functions, and what exactly are the syntax behind the functions, and also some examples to go along. So what exactly is a function? A function to me is defined whereby it takes in an input, and then this input itself is being processed, and then it generate an output. So this output itself is returned to the user. So for function, is it necessary for us to always return an output? Not necessary. You can actually create a function that does something, and then it doesn't have to return something back to the user. For example, I can create a function that take in an SQL query and then send the query into the database. So nothing is being returned to me at the end. I don't know if this function is being executed successfully because nothing is being returned back to me. So this is a function, but most of the time, we actually have a return statement at the end of the function because we want to actually return something back to the user. But keep that in mind that it's not necessary for us to always return something in a function. Alright, so let's just take a look at some examples we have here. So we have created a function called additional func that has two arguments, a and b, right? So what you want to do is at the end, we want to create the sum of these two parameters and then return it back to the user. So in this example, we have 1 and 2 as arguments. They are being fed into these functions. And then at the end, what we do is we return the sum of these two arguments, which is 3. It's just that simple. So there are actually no limits on how many parameters you can create for a function, but a good rule of thumb is not to exceed more than 3 parameters for a function. Reason being is actually quite confusing for the end user and also you when you actually look back into the function, because the more parameter you add into a function, the more confusing it is for your coding wise, right? So it's always important to actually do some documentation, try to document what each parameter does, and also what are the data type and requirement for each parameter before you actually use this function for any part of your code. So next question, why do we actually need to use function? To me, it's quite straightforward. Reason being is reusable. So what I mean by reusable is that you can use the function for any part of your code and you don't have to actually declare it every single time. The fact that it's reusable means that we can actually resolve the copy and paste issue when it comes to coding. So let's say if you have a big chunk of code and then you want to use it at the later part of your script, you can just copy and paste, but if it's just 1 or 2 lines, it's fine. I mean, no issue with that, just 1 or 2 lines, right? No big deal. But then if it is around 1000 lines of code, do you copy 1000 lines of code to the rest of your other script? You actually lengthen the whole script and you just make things more confusing and less manageable for the end user and also those people that are maintaining the code for you. So let's take a look at an example. So over here, what you can see is that on the left hand side is a script that doesn't use function, and on the right hand side we actually use function. So let's just say if we want to create a grading system. So what this grading system does is that it takes in a score from the user and then it will return whether it's you return a grade like awesome, good, or fail. So let's say it takes in 3 inputs from the user. So Michael's score, Jim's score, and Stanley's score. And then under the processing side, so here we see if we do an if statement. So if Michael's score is equals to 10, it will actually generate the awesome output for the user. And then if Michael's score is equals to 9, it will return good. And then anything below 9 will return fail. So we do the same thing for Jim and Stanley, right? As you can see, we actually copy and paste code, and then we just change the variable here from Michael's score to Jim's score, and then from Jim's score to Stanley's score. So everything else is the same. So this is why I call copy and pasting code, which is a terrible practice, because if we only have 3 lines of code, I think it's fine, not a big deal. But imagine if we have like 60 if statements, then there will be 60 lines, right? And then 60, 60, 60, right? There will be 63, 180 lines of code. That's just crazy. But if we actually use function, see how slick this is, right? So we create a function that takes in a score, right, as a parameter. And then here we says, we put in the if else statement here. So if score is equals to 10, return awesome, and then else if returns good, and then else anything below 9 returns as fail. So over here, notice how we can actually just put in the function, and then we put in Michael's score, and then here we put in Jim's score, and then Stanley's score, as opposed to just copy and pasting 3 lines of code for each score. So instead of copying pasting 3 lines, we just reduce it to 1 line, which is, this makes things much easier for you to actually manage. Also, in the long run, if you actually want to make some changes to the grading system, so for example, if score is equals to 8, return normal. Then if you don't have a function, you have to actually delete and key in the new requirement for each variable, right? Then over here, what we can do is we can just key in the requirement directly into the function, and then that's all we have to do. We just change once, and then you apply to all the other scores, as opposed to changing for each one here, right? So now you know why functions is actually necessary. It's actually used by almost every programmer out there. Reason being, it's actually much faster in terms of processing, and it's also easier to maintain and much more ethical, I would say, for the fellow programmers that are actually maintaining your code after you leave the company, for example. Before we actually touch on the syntax of this SQL function, it is important to know that we have to change the delimiter before we actually create this function. So what exactly is a delimiter? So let me give you an example. So let's say if we do a normal addition, so 2 plus 2, and what you see here is that I actually add in a semicolon, right? So a semicolon here is a delimiter. What a delimiter does is that it's telling SQL that I have completed this statement and I want you to execute it for me. So if I remove this delimiter, this SQL statement won't execute no matter how many times I press on enter, right? It doesn't execute. It's only until I add in this delimiter that it will actually execute this statement. So what we are trying to do here is we want to actually change the delimiter from a semicolon to a double slash. So why exactly do we have to do that? If we look into the full syntax of creating a function, I know this looks confusing, but if you actually spend some time looking at it, it's actually not that confusing. Okay, so you do notice that we actually add in semicolons within our functions. So here we have a semicolon, here a semicolon, there we have a semicolon. The reason why we want to use a semicolon is to tell SQL that here is this is an independent statement. We don't want this statement to leak into the subsequent statements. That's why we actually add in a semicolon, and it is necessary when you use it in a function. So we have to actually change the delimiter from a semicolon to a double slash. So if we actually don't add in if we actually don't change the delimiter, it will actually execute the statement until here, because the delimiter is semicolon. That's why we actually wanted to change the delimiter to prevent that from happening. Alright, so let's dive deeper into our function to understand what exactly is going on here. Alright, so from this line, we type in create function to tell SQL that we are actually going to create a function. And then here we type in a function name. So what name do you actually want to give to the function? So when it comes to naming, it's actually quite important for us to give it a good name, all right? Because chances are you're going to create hundreds of functions in your script, and it's very hard for you to actually manage the function unless you give it a good name. So let's say if you create a function that does additional of all the arguments, so you can name it as sum underscore function, or you can name it as additional underscore function, so on and so forth. But when it comes to naming convention, make sure that you create a name that you can understand. Even after months, when you actually come back to look back at the function, you can actually understand what it does. Right. So moving on, we have an argument. So this function takes in an argument. So it doesn't have to be one argument. It can take in, like I said, unlimited amount of argument, but it's important to just keep to less than 4, I would say. And then for this demo, we're just going to use one argument. So here we have an argument, and then here we have to state the data type of the argument. So it can be a varchar, it can be an integer, it can be a float, right? So next line, we actually returned the data type. So I'll explain this later. So next up, we do a begin. So this is where we start doing all the coding. And then here we have to declare. So the first thing we do after the begin statement is to actually declare the variable. So this variable, as you can see, is something that we want to return at the end, right? So the purpose of this function is to process the argument and then, like I said, generate an output, right? So this output is a variable, the pink color variable that I've actually colored here. So this variable, as you can see, is the data type for this variable is actually referring to the data type here. So when it comes to returns data type, this data type is actually the variable data type, right? So you're actually telling the SQL that, you know what, I want you to return a data type of the variable when I actually complete all this script. So here I actually declare the variable, and then once again, I have to type in the data type again. Don't ask me why is it like this. SQL is really weird. When it comes to other programming languages, it's not that weird, I would say. So for Python, you don't even have to declare the variable. You don't even have to declare the data type for Python. But for other languages, if I'm not wrong, C++, Java, you have to do that. And then moving on, we have the if statements. So it's not necessary for you to do an if statement inside a function. In fact, it's actually a bad practice. But for this demo, we're actually going to use an if statement because I want to actually demonstrate something. So here we have an if statement, right? So if a condition, and then you set a variable as something. So let's just say if a score is equals to 10, then set, like for example, gym score is equal to awesome, something like that. And then we have an else if, and then we have an else statement. And then over here, it's important for you to do an and if, right? An and if to tell SQL that, okay, you have completed all the if statements. And then next line, we have return variable. So you want to return something at the end of the function. So you have to tell SQL that I want to return a variable. And after that, you do an end. And then you notice here, we have a 2 double slashes to tell SQL to execute this whole function. And then at the end, we change the delimiter back to semicolon. So here's something really interesting. If you see here, we do a returns. This return has an S at the back, while this return has no S. So this is something you have to take note, because I think I was struggling when creating this demo because I actually forgot to key in the S. So I actually spent, I think, 1 hour trying to figure things out, and then I just keep comparing the example, and then eventually I found out that I actually forgot to key an S at the top here. So in terms of syntax, it actually differs a lot depend on what kind of SQL system you're using. So this is MySQL way of creating a function. When it comes to Postgre, it's definitely different. When it comes to SQLite, I think it's also different. So you have to actually look through the documentation, try to understand what are the syntax requirements before you actually create a function. Alright, so let's go through some example. So in this example, once again, we're going to use the customer and also the points table that we have created in previous exercises. So here we can see that we have, for customer, we have name, we have email, we have all the address, and then we have primary key here for customer. And then here we have points. So here we have the foreign key, and then we are using the customer ID to link these two tables together, right? So let's create a function that actually creates a point system that takes in the point and then award our members with a membership. So let's say if the points are more than 100, then we will reward them with a platinum membership, and then anything below 100 we will reward them with a gold membership, for example. So let's create this function. All right, so first thing we want to do is we want to create the delimiters. Right, you want to change the delimiter to /. And then next up, we want to create this function. So we do a create function. And then we want to name this function. So I call it as a point system. So this system takes in an argument, which is, for example, I will take in the score value. Probably not score value. I will call it a point value. So I do point input. And then this point input itself is an integer, right? Always remember to key in the data type. All right. And then next up, we want to return the data type of the variable that is returned from this function. So the data type that is being returned from this function is a varchar, because the variable that we want to return is platinum and gold, right? So these two words are actually characters, so they are not numbers. So we want to return varchar, and then we do a limit of 10, for example. So next up, we want to do begin. So begin the coding, and then here we want to declare. So for example, we can do score varchar 10. So score itself will be returned at the end of this function. So we declare it, and then we end the statement here. Next up, we can start typing in the if statement. So if the point input is more than 100, then set score will be equals to platinum, PLAT for short. And then anything below or equals to 100 will be gold. So else score, probably else set, we do it in the next line, else set score equals to gold. Right. And then now we want to end the if statement, so we do an end if, and then at the end we want to return the score, and then we do an end statement, and then we can finally add in the delimiter, which is // to execute this function. Bam, done. So always remember to change the delimiter back to semicolon. Okay, so now we have actually created this function successfully. Let's just do some execution. So the last time we did a left join, right? So we do a left join with customer and a point table. So let's do an inner join this time. So select star from customer, and then we do an inner join with points on customer dot class ID is equals to points dot class ID. All right, so we do an inner join, and we can see that John, Tom, and Nick have points of 21, 10, and 12. So how do we actually use the function for this statement? So what we can do here is we can in the function over here. So we select star, then we do a comma, and then we key in the function name. So the function name we have created is point system, point sys. So this point system takes in an argument. So it takes in the argument, obviously is points. So we're doing points, and let's see if it works. And yes, it does. So as you can see here, we have created an additional column for point system, and everyone is awarded gold. So they are gold because their points are below 100. So if it's more than 100, it will be platinum. So one more thing, if you actually want to remove this function, you can actually you can use the same method as you drop any tables or database. You can do drop function, and then the name of the function, which is point system. And you can see that it's already missing. It's already successfully deleted. So if you actually run this thing, it will say that the function itself does not exist. Alright, so this episode is actually the last episode of this SQL tutorial series. Thank you all so much for staying on for so long. This is actually my first completion of this series, and I'm not exactly sure if I'm doing a good job in it. So do let me know in the comments and also in Discord how bad or how well I do. So my plan for now is actually to create another tutorial series for R and also for Python. So my goal is to actually complete a few more series by the end of this year, so everyone can learn more about all these programming languages without having the need to buy any courses online. So thank you all for watching this tutorial series and also staying on with me for so long, and I will see you in the next one.